So another option that we can look at as far as these neural filters would go would be possibly separating the subject from the background a little bit. So this is a technique that has been around for several versions of Photoshop now, as well as built into a lot of smartphone devices that are applied automatically. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge everything down into one single layer. So I'm going to use that classic keyboard shortcut to do that. So it's if you're on the PC, it's Shift Control Alt. So all three, Shift Control and Alt, and the letter E. That should merge everything down as a merged layer. I'll just call this merge. If you're on the Mac, it's going to be Shift Command Option E to merge everything down. So with this merge version, this is going to have the subject as well as the background all in one single image. And this is sort of assuming what you'd be starting with anyway if this was a single image even before we had done this composite. So I'm going to go under the filter menu. Once again, neural filters. And this time we're going to look at this thing called depth blur, which is also in beta, so it hasn't been thoroughly tested and applied yet, but what you'll see here from what I've seen, it's working quite well. It has some edge issues, just like even the smartphone versions of these things are struggling with a little bit. Again, fine details in hair and little nuances between the mask edge, but essentially what it's doing is very much that. It's scanning around the contour of the subject, so it's able to detect the difference between the subject and the background. Similarly, the way that the object selection tool that we looked at earlier does. And then it's able to apply an artificial blur effect to the background and not to the subject, which is mimicking sort of the way that a camera's lens would be blurring out that background and while keeping a sharp, clean focus on the subject. So if you look into the settings down here, we have blur strength, right, where you can increase just how much blur is set to that background. And this blur is mimicking a type of blur in the depth of field. It's referred to as a bokeh blur or depth of focus, depth of field blur, compared to just a standard blur that you'd be seeing in Photoshop, which is typically called a Gaussian blur or surface blur, things like that. So this option that allows it to focus on the subject is the option that allowed us to separate there. Focal range, you'll see as you apply this slider, it's sort of pulling out the distance between the subject and the background, basically what it is. So that's going to encompass that blur effect, just how far away the background would be from the subject or how close the photographer's camera was from the subject when the image was taken. It's all mimicking all that, of course. You have the ability to go in and adjust all your usual options with the color and saturation blur for that. If you wanted to, you have the ability to click on your image in here to set your focal depth or your focal point if you're trying to drop sort of a focus point somewhere within a scene, where this one doesn't really work all that well simply because we have a finite distance in here. There's a wall that's X number of feet behind the subject as opposed to a scene where there's a lot more depth that might be involved. So it's pretty straightforward. You just apply that. It scans around the contour of the subject. We'll hit OK, and it creates that little bit of separation between the subject and background, which can make for a little bit more of an interesting portrait. Again, some little problems here that you're going to see, just like the smartphone options. Oh, I'm going to hide this. These backgrounds might be causing these. Yeah, it's still a little bit of an issue in there. Yeah, see a little bit of dirt around the edge there. It's not picking up all the hairs, but it's not doing a bad job from a distance. Looking quite well.